Somewhere in the hills of what is now Romania, a jawbone waited in the dark for 40,000 years. When cavers finally found it, they saw at once that something about it did not fit. The chin was almost modern, the back teeth were not. When scientists later opened its DNA, they found something no one expected from a man who lived so recently. Buried in his genome were long, unbroken stretches of Neanderthal ancestry, so long that they could only have come from a relative just 4 to 6 generations back. A great-great-grandparent, perhaps. Somewhere in that man's immediate family, a Neanderthal and a modern human had a child together, and that child's descendants carried the memory forward in their blood, whether they ever knew it or not. That single jawbone raises the question at the center of this investigation. For more than 100,000 years, two kinds of humans shared the same rivers, the same caves, the same cold nights under the same stars. Neanderthals and the ancestors of every person watching this film met, and they had children. That much the DNA proves beyond argument. But a harder question sits just behind it, one that no bone and no genome can answer directly. When a Neanderthal and a modern human came together, was that closeness chosen? Was it something like partnership, something recognizable as care or attraction? Or is that word, chosen, simply too human a word for us to be reaching for at all? This is not a small question, and it is not only about the distant past. It touches how we think about love, about difference, about what happens when two very different kinds of people are forced to decide, again and again, whether the person across the fire is a stranger, a threat, or someone worth staying close to. Every person of non-African ancestry alive today carries the genetic proof that this decision, whatever it was, happened often enough and successfully enough to leave a permanent mark on our species. Somewhere between 1 and 2% of your genome, if your ancestors came out of Africa, is not fully human in the narrowest sense. It is Neanderthal. It rode inside your ancestors for 1,800 generations to reach you. For most of the last century, science treated Neanderthals as a separate and inferior branch of the human family, a line that failed and vanished while our own line succeeded. That story has collapsed. New genetic research, some of it published only in the last 2 years, has rewritten the timeline of contact between our two kinds of people. It is no longer one meeting in one place. It now looks like waves of contact stretching back further than almost anyone expected, going back not 50,000 years but potentially 200,000 years, long before modern humans were thought to have left Africa in force. And within that contact, geneticists have found something stranger still, a pattern in the DNA that will not go away no matter how many genomes researchers examine. Mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, no matter how far back you trace a person's ancestry outside Africa, never turns up Neanderthal. And the Y chromosome, passed only from father to son, is the same story. No Neanderthal Y chromosome has ever been found in a living person. Something about these encounters left an asymmetric fingerprint, and understanding why that fingerprint exists takes us directly into the biology, and the possible violence, and the possible tenderness of contact between two kinds of humans who were, according to their own DNA, sitting right at the edge of what biology allows two different kinds of humans to do together. This film follows the actual evidence, not the fantasy version of it. We will walk through what the bones say, what the genomes say, what the dates say, and what remains, honestly, beyond our reach. We will meet the man from that Romanian cave, and the extraordinary woman whose skull rewrote the story of who arrived in Europe first. We will follow the researchers who found a hybrid child's bones in a cave north of Rome, and the researchers who worked out, gene by gene, that Neanderthal and human bodies may have been almost, but not quite, capable of producing children without cost. we will ask what daily contact between the two populations probably looked like, based on the tools, the sites, and the seasons where their paths crossed. And by the end, we will give you the most honest answer science currently allows to the question in the title. Some of that answer will surprise you. Some of it will disappoint anyone hoping for a simple love story. All of it is drawn from real evidence, openly explained, with every uncertainty left standing exactly where it belongs. Before we go further, here is a question worth sitting with as this story unfolds. In your own family, has anyone ever loved someone that others considered too different, too foreign, too much of an outsider to belong? Hold that question. It will matter more than you expect by the time this story reaches its end. The story does not begin in Romania, and it does not begin with romance. It begins much earlier, in a landscape neither modern human nor Neanderthal, where two populations that had been apart for hundreds of thousands of years were about to meet for what the evidence now says was not the first time and would not be the last. Geneticists now describe this contact not as a single event, but as a long, uneven relationship between two populations, stretched across tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles, with moments of closeness and long centuries of separation in between. Some encounters left children, most, almost certainly, did not. The DNA carried by nearly every person outside Africa today is not evidence of one meeting. It is the surviving residue of many, filtered by time, by chance, and by biology itself, down to the fraction that managed to survive inside a living human lineage for over 1,800 generations. What follows is the story of how researchers found that residue, what it can tell us about the lives behind it, and where the evidence simply stops. Chapter 1. Two kinds of human meet again. Long before either population had a name, there was a single ancestor they shared. Somewhere around 600,000 years ago, give or take tens of thousands, a population of early humans in Africa split. One branch stayed on the continent and, over a very long span of time, gave rise to what would eventually become our own species, Homo sapiens. The other branch moved north, out of Africa, into the colder, harder landscapes of Europe and Western Asia. That branch became the Neanderthals, along with a lesser-known cousin population called the Denisovans, who left their own trace in modern genomes further east. For a species built in the mild climates of Africa, moving into Ice Age Europe was not a small adjustment. Neanderthals had to solve for cold that modern humans in Africa had never faced. Over hundreds of thousands of years, their bodies changed in response. Their builds became shorter and heavier, better at conserving heat. Their chests grew broad and barrel-shaped, built for a body working hard in cold, thin mountain air. Their brow ridges thickened, their noses grew wide, which some researchers believe helped warm and humidify frigid air before it reached the lungs. None of this happened because Neanderthals were primitive. It happened because natural selection is a slow, patient sculptor, and cold Ice Age Europe was sculpting a population that would spend more than 300,000 years there before modern humans arrived in any numbers at all. While Neanderthals were adapting to ice sheets, glacial rivers, and herds of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros, the ancestors of modern humans were still in Africa, working out their own long adaptation to open grassland, dense forest, and the punishing heat of the equatorial sun. By roughly 300,000 years ago, something close to the anatomical form we would recognize as modern human had appeared on that continent. For a very long time afterward, these two populations, Neanderthal in Eurasia and modern human in Africa, existed almost entirely apart from one another, separated by desert, by sea, and by tens of thousands of years of separate evolutionary history. Separate does not mean isolated forever. Small groups of modern humans appear to have pushed north out of Africa more than once, long before the migration that most people picture when they think of humanity leaving its birthplace. Fossil evidence from sites in the Middle East, particularly caves in what is now Israel, shows modern human skeletons dating back roughly 180,000 to 200,000 years, far earlier than the major wave of migration that would eventually populate the rest of the world. These early wanderers were moving into territory that Neanderthals already occupied. For a long time, researchers assumed these early forays failed, that the small groups who left Africa early either died out or retreated, leaving no genetic trace behind. New genetic research published in 2024 turned that assumption upside down. A team led by researchers at Princeton University and Southeast University, using a computational method called IBD mix that can detect ancient DNA fragments with far greater precision than earlier tools, analyzed genetic material from thousands of living humans alongside several sequenced Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes. What they found was not one clean interbreeding event. It was a pattern of recurring contact, stretching back roughly 200 to 250,000 years, with another wave around 100 to 120,000 years ago, and then the largest and best documented wave around 50 to 60,000 years ago. In other words, modern humans and Neanderthals appear to have been meeting, mixing and separating again for the better part of 200,000 years, long before the migration that most textbooks describe as humanity's departure from Africa. Direct physical evidence for this earliest wave of contact has itself grown stronger in recent years. In 2021, a research team led by Professor Israel Hershkovitz of Tel Aviv University, working with the French National Center for Scientific Research, re-examined the skeleton of a child excavated decades earlier from School Cave on Mount Carmel in Israel, and estimated to be roughly 140,000 years old. Their analysis identified a combination of traits drawn from both Neanderthal and modern human anatomy present in the same skeleton, the earliest known fossil in the world to display this mixture, and one the research team interpreted as evidence of biological and social contact, including probable interbreeding, between the two populations at a date far earlier than the main mixing wave this documentary focuses on later. Hershkovitz and his colleagues noted that their findings helped explain a puzzle that had troubled other researchers, that fossils from this general region and period already showed an unusual blend of features, not cleanly matching either population on its own. A separate detail recovered from the same cluster of sites adds an unexpected dimension to this early period. Skeletal remains of a young child from school who lived with a severe congenital condition called hydrocephalus, a dangerous buildup of fluid around the brain, show that the child survived to roughly 3 years of age despite a disability that would have made independent survival essentially impossible. Evidence, in a population living tens of thousands of years before the main interbreeding wave, that sustained patient care for a vulnerable child was already part of how these very early communities lived, whatever their exact ancestry. This changes the emotional shape of the story in an important way. Contact between Neanderthals and modern humans was not a brief, dramatic first encounter between two total strangers who had never seen anything like each other before. By the time the best documented wave of interbreeding occurred, somewhere around 50,000 years ago, the two populations may already have had a long, if intermittent, history of crossing paths. Some of those early contacts likely ended in nothing. Populations met, perhaps competed for the same hunting grounds or river valleys, and separated again without leaving any lasting genetic trace, their lineages simply dying out over the following centuries. But others, evidently, ended differently. Children were born, and on rare occasions, as we will see, Those children's descendants survived long enough and successfully enough to carry a piece of that mixed ancestry all the way to the present day. By roughly 50,000 years ago, the stage for the best documented meeting was set. Neanderthal populations, after more than 300,000 years in Eurasia, were already showing signs of decline. Their numbers, based on genetic diversity, appear to have been small throughout their history, compared with the growing modern human population pushing up from the south. This population imbalance shows up clearly in the genetic evidence itself. When researchers compare the diversity found within Neanderthal genomes against the diversity found within modern human genomes from the same general period, the Neanderthal genomes consistently show far less variation, the genetic hallmark of a population that had likely never grown very large or very widespread at any point in its 300,000-year history, quite possibly never exceeding somewhere in the range of a few tens of thousands of individuals scattered thinly across the entire Eurasian landmass. Modern humans, meanwhile, were expanding out of Africa in a wave that would eventually spread across every inhabited continent, carrying with them a population base that, while still modest by later standards, was both larger and growing faster than anything the Neanderthal population had managed to sustain across its own long history. This imbalance mattered enormously for how any encounter between the two populations was likely to unfold. A small, thinly spread Neanderthal population encountering a larger, expanding modern human population was not meeting an equal in terms of raw numbers, even if the two populations were closely comparable in intelligence, technology, and social complexity, as the evidence increasingly suggests they were. Some researchers argue this numerical imbalance, more than any difference in ability, may have been the single most important factor determining what eventually happened to the Neanderthal population as a whole, a theme this documentary will return to directly in its final chapter. Somewhere in the overlap between a shrinking, deeply established population and a growing, newly arriving one, two kinds of humans stood face to face, close enough and often enough to have children together. What happened in that overlap zone is the question this documentary exists to answer as honestly as the evidence allows. It begins not with a skeleton or a study, but with the simple physical fact of two different peoples, each carrying more than 100,000 years of separate history in their bodies, sharing the same valley, the same firelight, and, evidently, sometimes the same bed. Chapter 2. The Land Where Two Worlds Overlapped. To understand what contact between Neanderthals and modern humans might actually have looked like, it helps to leave the genetics laboratory for a moment and stand, at least in imagination, on the ground where it happened. The most intensely studied overlap zone lies across a corridor stretching from the eastern Mediterranean through the Balkans and into Central Europe, a region archaeologists sometimes describe informally as a contact corridor, the most likely route by which modern humans moving out of Africa and the Near East would have encountered Neanderthal populations already settled across Europe. This was not gentle country. During the period in question, roughly 50 to 45,000 years ago, Europe sat deep inside the later stages of the last ice age. Winters were long and severe, summers were short. Large stretches of the continent were tundra or cold steppe, more like modern Siberia than modern France, dotted with herds of reindeer, wild horse, mammoth, and woolly rhinoceros. Forests existed only in patches, mostly in sheltered valleys. Rivers froze solid for months at a time. Anyone living in this landscape, Neanderthal or modern human, depended entirely on a deep, practical knowledge of where game moved with the seasons, where fresh water could be found even in winter, and where caves or rock shelters offered protection from wind that could kill an exposed person in hours. Neanderthals had been solving these problems for 300,000 years. Their sites across Europe show a mastery of the cold landscape that should put to rest any lingering idea that they were simple or unsophisticated. They controlled fire reliably. They made and repaired stone tools suited to specific tasks, from butchering large game to scraping hides. They hunted animals as large and dangerous as woolly rhinoceros and cave bear, which required coordinated group effort and considerable courage. Chemical evidence preserved in their teeth and bones, drawn from a technique called stable isotope analysis, which measures chemical traces left behind by the food a person actually ate, shows that Neanderthals across much of their range were eating a diet extremely high in meat, more consistent with top predators like wolves and hyenas than with a broadly omnivorous species. At one site in Croatia, researchers found that Neanderthal nitrogen isotope values matched or exceeded those of true apex carnivores living in the same landscape, evidence of a diet drawing almost entirely on the protein of large herbivores like reindeer, red deer, and horse. This picture of Neanderthals as committed, highly specialized meat-eaters has grown more nuanced, not less accurate, as researchers have refined their methods. A particularly striking 2019 study examined isotope signatures at the level of individual amino acids rather than bulk bone collagen, a more precise technique that resolved a long-standing puzzle involving two Neanderthal individuals whose bones showed nitrogen values so high they had previously been mistaken for evidence of fish consumption. The refined analysis told a different, more human story. One of the two individuals was an adult whose values reflected a diet built entirely on large land mammals. The other was an infant, still nursing, whose elevated nitrogen signature reflected nothing more exotic than breast milk from a mother who was herself a committed carnivore, since nursing infants naturally sit one trophic level above their mothers on any isotope scale. That detail, an ordinary nursing baby whose bones still carry the chemical signature of a nursing mother's own hard-won diet 45,000 years later, is a small but genuinely moving reminder of how intimately these Ice Age chemical traces connect to lives lived one family, one meal, one season at a time. At the same time, other researchers examining Neanderthal dental wear patterns and fossilized dental plaque across a broader geographic range have found real regional variation, with populations in warmer, more southern parts of their range showing greater evidence of incorporating plants, nuts and other gathered foods into an otherwise meat-heavy diet, a reminder that Neanderthals were not a single uniform population repeating identical behavior everywhere, but a species adapting its practical strategy to whatever specific landscape a given community called home. This was a population fully adapted, biologically and culturally, to extracting a hard living from one of the toughest environments early humans have ever occupied. Modern humans arriving in this landscape were not walking into an empty world waiting to be filled. They were walking into territory that Neanderthal families had known intimately for hundreds of generations. Territory with established hunting grounds, known caves, and established routes between summer and winter camps. Archaeological sites where the two populations' stone tool traditions appear in overlapping layers, one on top of the other in the same cave, going back and forth over centuries, suggest that in at least some places, the two populations were not simply passing each other at a distance. They were returning to the very same shelters, sometimes within a human lifetime of each other, sometimes possibly overlapping directly. One of the clearest physical signals of this overlap comes from a change in tool technology found across parts of Europe roughly 45,000 years ago, a transitional style that blends elements of the older Neanderthal stone tool tradition with newer approaches associated with incoming modern humans. Researchers have debated for decades what this blended technology actually represents. It might simply reflect Neanderthal groups independently inventing new tool styles as circumstances changed. It might reflect direct observation and copying between the two populations, without any deeper social contact required. Or it might reflect something closer to shared communities, where Neanderthal and modern human toolmakers were working, and possibly living, close enough together to influence each other's craft directly. The tools alone cannot settle which of these explanations is correct, but they do prove one thing beyond dispute. In some of these valleys and caves, the two populations were near enough to see, study, and in some cases plainly copy each other's most practical, hard-won survival technology. That is not the behavior of populations who never crossed paths. It is the behavior of neighbors. Neighbors is a careful word, chosen deliberately. It does not assume friendship. It does not assume hostility. It simply describes physical proximity close enough for repeated observation, and it is the minimum condition required for everything that follows in this investigation. To understand what that proximity meant day to day, it helps to know what a Neanderthal community actually looked like from the inside. A picture that became dramatically clearer in 2022, when a team led by researcher Laurits Skov, working with Svante Paabo at the Max Planck Institute, published the first genetic study of an entire Neanderthal social group. The team extracted usable DNA from 13 individuals found in 2 caves in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, Chagirskaya and Okladnikov, which Neanderthal families used as a seasonal hunting camp for thousands of years, returning again and again to butcher bison, reindeer, and other game brought down in the surrounding hills. 11 of these 13 individuals, 7 men and 6 women, including several children and adolescents, turned out to belong to a single, tightly connected community, related closely enough that researchers could reconstruct specific family relationships. Among them, a father and his teenage daughter. Among them, a pair of more distant relatives, a young boy and an adult woman who was likely his cousin, aunt, or grandmother. The genetic diversity across this group was low enough that researchers estimated the entire living community numbered somewhere around 10 to 20 people at any given time, a strikingly small number, and one consistent with Neanderthal community sizes documented at other sites as well. This finding also revealed a specific and important pattern in how these small communities were structured. Genetic analysis showed that the men in this group tended to be closely related to one another, while the women showed far greater genetic diversity relative to each other, a pattern researchers interpret as evidence that women frequently moved between different Neanderthal communities, likely at the time they reached adulthood, while men tended to remain within the community where they were born. One of the study's senior authors described the effect of this finding plainly, saying it made Neanderthals seem much more human, precisely because this pattern of women moving to join new communities while men stayed rooted in their birth group closely resembles kinship and residence patterns documented across a great many human societies studied by anthropologists in more recent history. This detail carries real weight for the question this documentary is investigating. If women were the ones who typically moved between Neanderthal communities, following long-established social patterns already built into how their society functioned, then the same basic social mechanism, a woman leaving her birth community to join another group, may well have applied when the community she joined was not entirely made up of fellow Neanderthals. Movement between groups, in other words, may already have been a normal, expected part of Neanderthal social life long before modern humans ever entered the picture, meaning that when modern human bands did appear nearby, any resulting contact between the two populations would have been layered on top of social habits and expectations that already existed, rather than requiring some entirely unprecedented kind of behavior. The Shagiskaya study revealed one further detail worth holding on to. Even in this small, remote, genetically isolated community, tucked into caves at the easternmost known edge of Neanderthal territory, researchers found traces of a Denisovan ancestor somewhere between 12 and 48,000 years back in the group's family tree. Evidence that contact and mixing between different archaic human populations had touched even this most out-of-the-way corner of the Neanderthal world at some point in the deeper past, echoing the direct proof of Neanderthal and Denisovan mixing that Denny's remains would later provide from a cave not far away. Mixing between different kinds of ancient humans, the evidence increasingly suggests, was not confined to a few dramatic, isolated meetings in one place. It was a recurring undercurrent running through ancient human social life across a huge span of Eurasia, appearing again and again wherever different populations found themselves close enough and connected enough through existing patterns of movement to make it possible. Before two populations can have children together, they must first be close enough, often enough, for that possibility to exist at all. The land itself, the caves, the tools, and the seasonal rhythms of Ice Age Europe tell us that this condition was met, not once in a single dramatic encounter, but repeatedly, across a corridor of contact stretching for thousands of years and hundreds of miles. What happened inside that proximity? Whether it looked more like curiosity, trade, conflict, or something approaching partnership, is where the investigation now turns, starting with the genetic proof that, whatever else happened, children were born. Chapter 3. The Proof, Written in Blood. For most of the 20th century, the question of whether Neanderthals and modern humans ever had children together was, in the strictest scientific sense, unanswerable. Fossils could show physical similarity or difference. They could never show ancestry directly, because bones do not carry a family tree written on their surface. Researchers could compare skull shapes, argue about jaw structure, and debate whether certain skeletons looked like they might represent a mixed population, but without a way to read the genetic code itself. The debate remained, at bottom, a matter of educated guessing dressed up as science. That changed with the development of ancient DNA extraction, a technology that took decades of frustration to perfect. DNA degrades over time. In a fresh corpse, the genetic code sits neatly bundled inside cells, protected and intact. In a 40,000-year-old bone that has spent millennia buried in soil, exposed to bacteria, groundwater, and temperature swings, that same genetic code has been shattered into millions of tiny broken fragments, contaminated with the DNA of every bacterium, fungus, and passing animal that touched the bone across tens of thousands of years. Reading a genuine ancient human sequence out of that chaos is a little like trying to reconstruct a shredded letter that has been mixed into a landfill and left in the rain, using only a handful of scattered, illegible fragments. The scientist most responsible for solving this problem was Svante Paabo, a Swedish geneticist working at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany. Paabo spent much of his career developing methods to isolate and authenticate genuinely ancient DNA sequences, distinguishing real prehistoric genetic material from modern contamination introduced by careless handling, or even by the breath of the researchers themselves. It was slow, exacting, often disappointing work. Many early claimed sequences later turned out to be contaminated modern DNA, including, embarrassingly, results from Paabo's own earliest research, decades before his eventual triumph, when his laboratory extracted what appeared to be ancient dinosaur DNA that later proved to be nothing more than modern contamination introduced during handling. That early failure shaped Parbo's entire subsequent approach, convincing him that any laboratory serious about ancient DNA needed physical safeguards strict enough to rule out contamination before it happened, not simply detect it afterward. Parbo's team went on to build increasingly rigorous standards specifically to avoid that trap, developing dedicated clean rooms sealed off from any modern human genetic material, protective suits and full-face coverings for every researcher entering the extraction area, positive air pressure systems to keep outside contamination from drifting in, and statistical tests capable of distinguishing the specific chemical damage patterns that accumulate naturally in genuinely ancient DNA over thousands of years from the pristine, undamaged DNA of a careless technician's own skin cells. These precautions were not excessive caution for its own sake. They were the only way to ensure that when the team finally did announce a result, as significant as the first Neanderthal genome, the wider scientific community could trust that what they were looking at was genuinely 40,000 years old, and not the accidental fingerprint of whoever had handled the bone most recently. The breakthrough came in 2010, when Parbo's team published the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome, assembled from small bone fragments recovered from Vindija Cave in Croatia. Comparing this reconstructed Neanderthal genetic code against the genomes of living humans from populations across the world produced a result that stunned much of the scientific community. People whose ancestry traced outside Africa, meaning nearly everyone of European, Asian, Pacific Islander and indigenous American descent, carried small but consistent traces of Neanderthal DNA, typically between 1 and 2% of their total genome. People whose ancestry traced entirely within sub-Saharan Africa did not carry this signature, or carried only very faint amounts through more recent back migration. This distribution was the genetic smoking gun. It meant that the mixing between Neanderthals and modern humans had to have happened after modern humans began leaving Africa, somewhere in the overlap zone described in the last chapter, and that the resulting mixed ancestry had then spread outward as modern human populations continued their migration across Europe, Asia, and eventually into the Americas and the Pacific. This finding did more than answer an old academic argument. It quietly rewrote the biological definition of what a Neanderthal was. If Neanderthals and modern humans could produce children capable of surviving, reproducing, and passing their combined ancestry down through tens of thousands of generations, then the two populations were not separate species in the strictest textbook sense of that word, where different species are defined partly by their inability to produce fertile offspring together. They were, at most, closely related populations, similar enough biologically to interbreed successfully, at least under some circumstances. Many researchers today prefer to describe them as separate human populations or subspecies rather than fully separate species, precisely because of this evidence. The old image of the Neanderthal as a doomed evolutionary dead end, replaced and discarded by a superior modern human newcomer, does not survive contact with the genetic record. Neanderthals were not simply replaced. In a very real, measurable sense, they were partly absorbed. The scale of what Parbo had accomplished did not go unrecognized. In October of 2022, more than a decade after that first Neanderthal genome was published, Parbo received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, awarded specifically for his discoveries concerning the genomes of extinct hominins and human evolution. In its official citation, the Nobel Committee described what Parbo had achieved as something seemingly impossible, extracting and reading usable genetic sequence from bones tens of thousands of years old, degraded, contaminated, and long presumed by most researchers to be beyond the reach of any existing technology. His work did not simply answer one question about Neanderthals. It created an entirely new scientific field, now known as paleogenomics, the study of genetic material recovered directly from ancient and extinct organisms, a field that has since expanded far beyond human evolution to include everything from woolly mammoths to medieval plague victims to ancient crops. The Nobel Committee specifically highlighted the discovery that gene transfer had occurred between modern humans and these extinct hominin populations following the migration out of Africa, noting that this ancient flow of genetic material continues to carry real, measurable physiological relevance for people alive today, particularly in how the immune system responds to infection, a theme this documentary will return to in its final chapter. Since that first 2010 breakthrough, the picture has only grown more detailed. In 2017, a team including K. Prufer and Parbo published a second, far higher quality Neanderthal genome, this one from a woman whose bone fragments were recovered from Vindija Cave in Croatia, dated to more than 45,000 years old. To build this genome, the team sequenced 24 billion individual fragments of DNA extracted from the bone, of which only about 1 in 10 could be confidently matched to the human genome at all, the rest belonging to bacteria, fungi, and other organisms that had colonized the bone over tens of thousands of years underground. The usable fragments averaged just 53 base pairs in length, tiny broken pieces of what had once been a complete functioning genetic code, painstakingly reassembled through 30-fold coverage of the roughly 1.8 billion positions in the genome that short fragments like these can reliably confirm. Rigorous contamination testing, comparing specific genetic markers known to differ consistently between Neanderthals and modern humans, confirmed that the sample was overwhelmingly genuine ancient material, with only a small fraction, under 1% in most measurements, attributable to modern human contamination introduced during excavation or handling. Because this Vindija woman turned out to be more closely related to the specific Neanderthal population that had actually interbred with the ancestors of modern humans than the original Siberian genome from 2010 had been, her genome allowed researchers to identify a meaningfully larger share of Neanderthal ancestry hiding in modern human genomes than earlier estimates had captured, refining the widely cited 1 to 2% figure upward slightly to a range closer to 1.8 to 2.6% for many present-day populations. Researchers have continued sequencing additional Neanderthal genomes from sites across Europe and Asia since, along with genomes from a related population called the Denisovans, identified initially from a single finger bone fragment found in a cave in Siberia. Denisovans left their own genetic legacy, concentrated most heavily in the genomes of people from Papua New Guinea, parts of Southeast Asia, and Australia, some of whom carry as much as 4 to 6% Denisovan ancestry, evidence of a separate and largely independent history of contact happening further east, likely involving multiple distinct interbreeding events with different Denisovan populations at different points in time. The overall picture that has emerged over the past 15 years is not one isolated meeting between two entire populations. It is a genuinely complex, layered history of encounter, spread across different archaic human groups, different regions, and different time periods, each leaving its own distinct fingerprint in the genomes of people alive today. For this documentary, the central fact established in this chapter is simple to state and enormous in its implications. The genetic evidence proves, beyond any reasonable scientific doubt, that Neanderthals and modern humans had children together more than once, in more than one place, over an extended period of time. That is not speculation. It is measured, repeated, independently verified fact, confirmed by multiple research teams using different methods on different genetic samples, arriving at compatible conclusions. What remains far harder to establish, and what the rest of this investigation must approach with far greater caution, is what those encounters actually felt like to the people living through them, and whether anything resembling choice, in the way we use that word today, played any part in how they came about. Chapter 4: 6 Skeletons and a Skull. In December of 2024, two of the world's leading scientific journals published research that gave the story of Neanderthal and human contact its sharpest timeline yet. The first study, published in the journal Nature and led in part by researcher Johannes Krause and colleagues, focused on genomes recovered from a cave near the German town of Ranis, along with a remarkably complete skull recovered from a site called Zlatý kůň in the Czech Republic. The Ranis cave yielded the genetic material of 6 individuals, 3 women and 3 men, who lived roughly 45,000 years ago, making theirs among the oldest confirmed modern human genomes ever sequenced from European soil. The Zlatý kůň skull belonged to a woman who lived around the same period, and whose remarkably well-preserved genome allowed the research team to examine her ancestry in unusual detail. What these 7 individuals shared, despite living in different places and possibly different communities, was a strikingly similar pattern of Neanderthal ancestry embedded in their genomes. By analyzing the length of the Neanderthal-derived segments in their DNA, a technique that works because genetic segments inherited from a distant ancestor get progressively chopped into smaller and smaller pieces each generation through a natural process called recombination, the research team was able to estimate how many generations had passed since the Neanderthal ancestry entered their family line. Long, unbroken segments mean a recent mixing event. Short, heavily fragmented segments mean a much older one. The Ranis and Zlatý kůň individuals showed segment lengths consistent with a mixing event that had occurred a few tens of generations before their own lifetimes, placing the core period of interbreeding at somewhere between 49,000 and 45,000 years ago. The second study, published in Science, and led by researchers Leonardo Iassi and Manjusha Chintalapati, working with teams at the Max Planck Institute and the University of California, Berkeley, approached the same question from a different angle. Rather than focusing on a handful of very old genomes, this team analyzed 59 ancient genomes spanning a period from roughly 2,000 to 45,000 years old, comparing them against 275 present-day human genomes from populations around the world. By tracking how Neanderthal genetic segments changed in length and frequency across this enormous span of time, the researchers were able to build what amounts to a genetic clock, pinpointing the period of mixing to between roughly 50,500 and 43,500 years ago, with an average estimated date of about 47,000 years ago. The convergence of these two independent studies, using different genetic samples and different analytical methods, arriving at closely matching dates, gives researchers unusually high confidence in the timeline. It also confirmed something else important. This was not one isolated encounter. The science paper's authors described the interbreeding period as a single extended episode of mixing lasting for roughly 6,000 to 7,000 years, likely involving many separate instances of contact and reproduction across multiple generations, rather than one dramatic meeting that produced every trace of Neanderthal DNA carried by people today. Different groups of modern humans appear to have continued mixing with Neanderthal populations for varying lengths of time as they moved across the landscape, which helps explain a curious detail long observed in modern genomes. People of East Asian ancestry today carry noticeably more Neanderthal DNA, roughly 20% more, than people of European ancestry. If the ancestors of East Asian populations continued moving east and continued encountering Neanderthal groups along the way, after the ancestors of European populations had already settled and stopped mixing, that would produce exactly this pattern. This geographic detail matters because it shows the interbreeding story cannot be reduced to a single population meeting a single other population in a single place, the way a simplified retelling might suggest. It was instead a rolling, ongoing process, unfolding differently for different groups of modern humans, depending on exactly which direction they traveled, how long their journey took, and how many Neanderthal communities they encountered and potentially mixed with along the way. A modern human band that settled quickly in what is now Western Europe would have had a narrower window of opportunity for contact than a band that continued moving steadily eastward across Asia for additional centuries or millennia, passing through more Neanderthal territory, and by some evidence, encountering Denisovan populations further east as well, layering additional archaic ancestry on top of whatever Neanderthal ancestry their lineage had already acquired. The genome of any person alive today, in this sense, is not simply a record of one ancient meeting. It is a record of a specific migratory path, taken by specific ancestors, through a landscape where different archaic populations were encountered, or not encountered, in different combinations and at different points along the way. An individual history as unique and particular as a family's own more recent journey across oceans and generations. The Zlati Kun woman deserves particular attention because her story illustrates a theme that will return throughout this investigation. Genetic analysis of her remains showed she carried Neanderthal ancestry consistent with the broader Ranis population, but intriguingly, researchers found no evidence that she left descendants among later European populations. Her lineage, so far as the genetic record can currently show, appears to have ended without continuing forward into people alive today. This is a sobering reminder that not every person who carried mixed ancestry became an ancestor of later humanity. Many, probably most, individual lines from this period, whether purely Neanderthal, purely modern human, or mixed, simply ended, victims of the ordinary brutal arithmetic of prehistoric survival, disease, and chance, long before they could contribute meaningfully to the deep genetic pool that would eventually produce the 8 billion people alive today. Taken together, these two 2024 studies transformed a vague, decade-old estimate that interbreeding happened sometime between 50 and 80,000 years ago into a precise and independently confirmed window centered on roughly 47,000 years ago and lasting for several thousand years. That precision matters enormously for the question this documentary is asking. It tells us the encounters were not scattered across tens of thousands of years of accidental, occasional contact. They were concentrated in a specific, intensive period, most likely corresponding to the years immediately following modern humans' major migration into Neanderthal territory across Europe and Western Asia. In other words, the strongest evidence for contact clusters precisely around the period when the two populations were most directly competing for the same land, the same herds, and the same caves. The Ranis and Zlati Kun findings concern modern humans carrying Neanderthal ancestry from mixing events some generations in their past. A separate, even more startling discovery, made a few years earlier, in a very different part of the world, shows what the moment of mixing itself can look like when it is caught, almost by accident, in a single individual's genome. In 2012, archaeologists working at Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia recovered a tiny fragment of long bone, no larger than the tip of a thumb, from among more than 2,000 similarly unidentifiable bone scraps pulled from the site's ancient sediment layers. For years, the fragment sat uncatalogued as one specimen among thousands, its species unknown, its significance completely unsuspected. It was eventually identified as belonging to a hominin using a technique called collagen peptide fingerprinting, which can distinguish human bone from animal bone based on subtle protein signatures even when a fragment is too small and featureless to identify by eye. Once flagged as potentially human, the fragment was sent to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, where geneticist Viviane Slon, working under Svante Pääbo, extracted and sequenced its DNA. What the sequencing revealed, published in 2018, was almost too remarkable to believe at first. The bone belonged to a girl who died at roughly 13 years old, some 90,000 years ago, a girl researchers affectionately nicknamed Denny. Her genome showed, in Slon's own words, that each of her chromosome pairs carried one Neanderthal copy and one Denisovan copy, with almost no mixing between the two within her own body. This was not the pattern of someone whose distant ancestors had interbred generations earlier, the pattern seen in people like OAC1 or in modern humans today. This was the unmistakable signature of a first-generation child, a girl whose mother was, in the fullest sense, a Neanderthal, and whose father was, in the fullest sense, a Denisovan, an entirely separate archaic human population whose closest known population center was that very cave in Siberia. Slon was so startled by the result that she resequenced the sample from a different spot on the bone, certain there had been an error or contamination. The second sample returned the identical answer. She ran the analysis 6 times in total. Every result matched. Denny remains, to date, the only confirmed first-generation hybrid ever identified between 2 distinct archaic human populations, and her existence carries an implication that reaches well beyond her own short life. Researchers involved in the study have pointed out that finding a first-generation hybrid at all, among the extremely small number of archaic human genomes that have ever been successfully sequenced, is statistically remarkable. Denisova Cave has yielded only a handful of usable ancient genomes across the entire span of human research. The odds of one of that tiny handful happening to be a first-generation hybrid, purely by chance, are vanishingly small, unless interbreeding between Neanderthals and Denisovans, whenever and wherever the two populations happen to overlap geographically, was common enough that a meaningful fraction of the population in a contact zone carried mixed parentage at any given time. Denny's own genome hints at a still deeper layered history behind her, since traces within her father's Denisovan ancestry suggest that his own lineage had already mixed with Neanderthals at some earlier point, evidence of contact happening again and again across generations in the same region, not as a singular, exceptional event, but as a recurring feature of life in a place where different kinds of humans regularly crossed paths. Denny's story reframes the entire question this documentary is asking, because it proves something the other evidence in this film can only imply indirectly. Interbreeding between distinct archaic human populations was not confined to Neanderthals and modern humans alone. It happened between Neanderthals and Denisovans as well, in a completely different region, tens of thousands of years before the main wave of Neanderthal and modern human mixing this film has traced through Ranis, Zlati Kun, and Oase 1. Wherever different kinds of ancient humans found themselves close enough for long enough, the genetic record increasingly suggests that children resulted, not as a rare anomaly, but as a recurring, almost predictable outcome of sustained proximity between populations still similar enough, in David Reich's phrase, to sit at the edge of biological compatibility with one another. Understanding what that competition and that closeness actually meant for the individuals living through it requires turning from population-level statistics to the extraordinary story of one man's family tree, written into a single jawbone. Chapter 5: The Man with a Neanderthal Great-Great-Grandparent. In 2002, cavers exploring a limestone cave system in southwestern Romania called Peștera cu Oase, which translates roughly as cave with bones, discovered a human jawbone lying among the remains of cave bears that had denned there for thousands of years during the Ice Age. The jaw was later dated by radiocarbon methods to between 37,000 and 42,000 years old, making its owner a man researchers would come to call OAC1, one of the earliest confirmed modern humans to have lived in Europe. His face was mostly modern in structure, but certain features, including some aspects of his jaw and teeth, struck researchers even before genetic testing as slightly unusual, carrying hints of something older, something that did not sit entirely comfortably within the expected range of early modern human anatomy. The cave that held his remains was, and remains, an unusually difficult place to reach, a fact that likely explains why his bones survived undisturbed for so many thousands of years. Reaching the galleries where the jawbone was found required navigating flooded passages that could only be crossed safely by scuba diving through narrow, water-filled sections of the cave system, a restriction that had sealed the site off from casual disturbance for millennia. The cavers who made the initial discovery, recognizing its potential importance, brought in cave biologist Oana Moldovan and evolutionary anthropologist Erik Trinkhaus, who assembled a small international team to properly document the find. Over the following field seasons, that team recovered more than 5,000 bones from the cave's side gallery, the overwhelming majority belonging to cave bears that had used the space as a winter den across thousands of years, alongside additional human remains. In 2003, researchers found a second set of remains scattered on the surface of the cave floor, and through painstaking work across the 2004 and 2005 field seasons, eventually recovered 38 separate cranial fragments belonging to a second individual, a nearly complete skull researchers designated OACE-2. Analysis of this second skull showed a similarly unusual mixture of modern and archaic features, reinforcing the picture drawn from the jawbone alone, that the small community using this cave, whoever exactly they were, carried physical traits that did not fit neatly into a simple, uncomplicated modern human category. Erik Trinkhaus, reflecting on how the human remains might have ended up in such a remote, difficult-to-access part of the cave system, has suggested one real possibility, that the cave itself may have served this small community as a place set aside specifically for the ritual disposal of their dead, a mortuary space chosen precisely because of its remoteness and difficulty of access, though this interpretation remains one plausible explanation among others rather than settled fact. Extracting usable DNA from the jawbone proved extraordinarily difficult. The specimen contained only small amounts of preserved human genetic material, badly degraded by tens of thousands of years underground. A research team led by geneticist Qiaomei Fu, working with senior collaborators including Svante Pääbo and Harvard geneticist David Reich, used a targeted enrichment strategy, essentially a way of fishing out only the specific genetic sites most informative about ancestry from an ocean of degraded and contaminated material to reconstruct a usable picture of OACE1's genome. What they found, published in the journal Nature in 2015, startled even researchers who were by then well accustomed to finding Neanderthal ancestry in ancient human genomes. OACE1 carried between 6 and 9% Neanderthal ancestry in his genome, several times higher than the 1 to 2% typically found in people today, and higher than any other ancient or modern human genome sequenced up to that point. More striking still was the structure of that ancestry. When a person's Neanderthal DNA comes from an ancestor many thousands of years in the past, that ancestry arrives broken into many short fragments, chopped apart generation after generation by the ordinary genetic shuffling that happens every time a child is conceived. OASE-1's Neanderthal ancestry was not like that. 3 segments of his genome, each carrying Neanderthal ancestry, were unusually long, some spanning more than 50 centimorgans, a genetic length that simply does not have time to accumulate that intact after many generations of mixing. Long, unbroken segments like these are the genetic signature of very recent ancestry. Based on the size of these segments, the research team calculated that OASE-1 had a Neanderthal ancestor as recently as 4 to 6 generations back in his family tree. A great-great-grandparent, in other words, or at most, a great-great-great-grandparent. Read plainly. This means that somewhere in OASE-1's immediate family, within living memory for people of his own generation, a Neanderthal parent and a modern human parent, or possibly a Neanderthal grandparent, had a child together, and that child's descendants carried the OASE family line forward until it produced the man whose jawbone would eventually be found in a Romanian cave 40,000 years later. This was not a distant, half-legendary ancestor from some ancient founding population. This was recent, immediate, personal family history, the kind of ancestry a person in OASE-1's own community might plausibly have known about, discussed, or simply lived alongside as an unremarkable fact of who their relatives were. And yet OASE-1's story carries its own quiet warning against romantic overreach. Despite carrying such an unusually high proportion of Neanderthal ancestry, genetic analysis found no evidence that OASE-1 left descendants among the populations who would go on to settle Europe in the millennia that followed. His particular family line, so far as researchers can currently tell, appears to be a genetic dead end, absorbed into the historical record, but not passed forward into the deep ancestry of people alive today. Harvard's David Reich, who helped coordinate the study, noted this directly at the time, observing that the OASE population did not appear to make a substantial genetic contribution to later European populations. This detail matters for understanding the larger picture. It is tempting, once you learn that one man carried a Neanderthal great-great-grandparent, to imagine that Neanderthal and human mixing was constant, frequent, and thoroughly ordinary across the entire region and time period. The truth the evidence supports is more specific and, in some ways, more interesting. Mixing clearly did happen, sometimes recently and directly enough to leave enormous traces like the ones found in OASE-1's genome. But whether any particular mixed family line survived long-term, contributing meaningfully to later human ancestry, depended on the same brutal, indifferent forces of chance, disease, climate, and competition that determined survival for every family, mixed or otherwise, during this period. Some mixed lineages, like the one carried down to OASE-1, appear to have simply ended. Others, harder to trace directly to any single named individual, succeeded well enough to leave the 1 to 2% trace of Neanderthal ancestry carried by billions of people alive today. OASE-1 is not, in fact, alone in the record. A comparison case, discovered thousands of miles away, helps place his story in a wider context. In 2008, a bone carver, searching a Siberian riverbank for mammoth ivory, instead found a human thigh bone, later dated to approximately 45,000 years old, and recovered near the town of Ust-Ishim in western Siberia. When Pabo's team sequenced this individual's genome, they found roughly 2% Neanderthal ancestry, close to the amount carried by people today, but arranged in unusually long, unbroken genetic segments, indicating that his own Neanderthal ancestor lived only 7 to 13,000 years before he did, considerably more recent than the deep, heavily fragmented Neanderthal ancestry found in most people today. though far less dramatically recent than the 4 to 6 generations found in OASE-1. Like the woman from Zlatý discussed earlier, and like OASE-1 himself, genetic analysis found that the Ust-Ishim man left no identifiable descendants among later Eurasian populations. One more individual life, fully documented down to the level of his genome, whose particular family line simply ended, absorbed into the great churn of prehistoric population turnover without leaving a lasting trace in anyone living today. Placed side by side, OASE-1, the Ust-Ishim man, and the Zlatý woman sketch a consistent and important pattern. Every one of the very earliest modern human genomes recovered from Europe and northern Asia, individuals living in the direct aftermath of the main interbreeding period this documentary has traced, carries some trace of recent Neanderthal ancestry, ranging from the roughly 2 to 3% typical of a mixing event tens of generations in the past, all the way up to OASE-1's extraordinary 6 to 9% from just a handful of generations back. And in every one of these cases, so far as current genetic evidence can determine, that individual's particular lineage appears to have ended without contributing directly to later populations. This tells us something sobering and important about how prehistoric survival actually worked. Carrying Neanderthal ancestry was not rare among the earliest populations settling Europe and Asia. It may in fact have been close to universal among them. What was rare was any single family line, mixed or otherwise, surviving the brutal arithmetic of disease, climate, and chance across enough generations to become a measurable part of humanity's deep genetic inheritance today. The Neanderthal ancestry carried by people alive right now did not descend from any one of these documented individuals specifically. It survived because, somewhere among the vast number of similar unrecorded lives lived across this same period, a few lineages, by chance as much as by any other factor, made it through. What OASE-1 gives this investigation, more than any statistic, is scale. He gives us a face, or at least a jaw, and a family tree short enough to imagine. 4 to 6 generations is not an abstraction measured in tens of thousands of years. It is the kind of span within which an elderly person today might still remember stories about their own great-great-grandparents, told to them as children by parents who had heard them from grandparents in turn. Somewhere in OASE-1's community, there was very likely a living person, a parent or a grandparent, who had personally known, or personally been, someone with a Neanderthal parent or grandparent. That closeness, immediate and generational rather than distant and mythical, is the emotional core this investigation must now try to understand more deeply, moving from the fact that these encounters happened toward the far more difficult question of what they were actually like for the people who lived them. Chapter 6. The Piece That Is Missing. If you want to understand how difficult it truly was for a Neanderthal and a modern human to have a child together, and what that difficulty might tell us about the nature of their encounters, there is no better place to look than a single, glaring gap in the human genome. It is called the Neanderthal Y chromosome desert, and it is one of the strangest and most revealing findings in the entire history of ancient DNA research. Every part of the modern human genome, when researchers go looking, carries at least some trace of Neanderthal ancestry somewhere among the population, scattered across different individuals and different chromosomes. Every part, that is, except 2. No confirmed Neanderthal Y chromosome, the chromosome passed only from father to son, has ever been found in a living human male. And no confirmed Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed only from mother to child, regardless of the child's sex, has ever been found in any living person at all. Both lineages, the strictly paternal line and the strictly maternal line, show a complete and total absence of Neanderthal ancestry, even though every other part of the genome carries the expected trace. For a long time, this absence puzzled researchers. If Neanderthals and modern humans had children together often enough to leave 1 to 2% Neanderthal ancestry scattered across the rest of the genome, why would two very specific genetic lineages be completely wiped clean of any Neanderthal signal? Geneticists eventually converged on an explanation rooted in a much older and more general biological pattern called Haldane's rule, named after the British biologist J.B.S. Haldane, who first described it in the 1920s while studying hybrid animals. Haldane observed that when two closely related but distinct species or populations interbreed, and their hybrid offspring suffer reduced fertility or survival, that reduced fertility overwhelmingly affects the sex that carries two different sex chromosomes rather than two matching ones. In mammals, where females carry two X chromosomes and males carry one X and one Y, this means male hybrids are disproportionately likely to be infertile, sickly, or simply non-viable. The pattern shows up again and again across the animal kingdom. In crosses between lions and tigers, for example, female hybrids called ligers or tigans are often fertile, while male hybrids are almost always sterile. Researchers studying the Neanderthal Y chromosome desert believe something very similar happened between Neanderthals and modern humans. A landmark study led by geneticist Fernando Mendes, examining the small number of preserved Neanderthal Y chromosome sequences available, identified specific genetic mutations that could plausibly have caused serious problems for male hybrid offspring. One of the most striking findings involved a gene connected to a protein recognized by the mother's immune system during pregnancy. Mendes's team found that a Neanderthal version of this gene could potentially trigger an immune reaction in a modern human mother carrying a male fetus, a reaction serious enough to cause the pregnancy to fail. If this mechanism operated consistently, modern human women who conceived sons with Neanderthal fathers may have miscarried those pregnancies at elevated rates, generation after generation, until any lineage carrying a Neanderthal Y chromosome was gradually and thoroughly eliminated from the population. A separate and equally important line of evidence comes from Harvard geneticist David Reich's laboratory, which examined not just the Y chromosome but the X chromosome as well, and found something almost as striking. Neanderthal ancestry across the X chromosome in modern human genomes is dramatically reduced compared with Neanderthal ancestry found on other chromosomes, what researchers describe as a Neanderthal ancestry desert. Reich's team also found that genes expressed heavily in human testes, tissue directly involved in producing viable sperm, were significantly depleted of Neanderthal ancestry compared with genes expressed elsewhere in the body. Taken together, these two findings point toward the same underlying conclusion. Male hybrid offspring, carrying a mix of Neanderthal and modern human genetics, appear to have faced serious fertility problems, likely severe enough that many, perhaps most, were unable to have children of their own, cutting off their particular genetic lines within a generation or two. It is worth being precise about what this evidence does and does not claim, because the finding is easy to overstate in either direction. Researchers are not suggesting that every male child born to a Neanderthal and modern human pairing was infertile, or that no Neanderthal Y chromosome ever existed among early mixed populations at all. The evidence instead points to a population-level statistical pattern, accumulated and made visible only across many thousands of years and countless individual pregnancies. Some male hybrid children were very likely born fertile and capable of having their own children. But across the full population of these unions, over the long run, the mathematics of natural selection tell a consistent story. Male hybrid offspring carrying certain specific combinations of Neanderthal genetic material were disadvantaged often enough, generation after generation, that any Neanderthal Y chromosome lineage was eventually and completely filtered out of the modern human gene pool, even as other Neanderthal genetic material, inherited through daughters and through the rest of the genome, continued to survive and, in places, even thrive. This is precisely the kind of pattern that individual family stories, even ones as detailed as OASE-1's, cannot reveal on their own. It only becomes visible when researchers step back and examine the aggregate genetic record of tens of thousands of years and thousands of individual lives, a scale far beyond anything a single skeleton or a single burial can show. Reich summarized the implication of this evidence with a phrase that deserves to sit at the very center of this documentary's investigation. He said the pattern tells us that when Neanderthals and modern humans met and mixed, they were, in his words, at the very edge of being biologically compatible, not comfortably compatible, not effortlessly compatible, at the edge, close enough that children were sometimes born and sometimes, evidently, survived and thrived, as the case of OASE-1 dramatically shows, but close enough only barely, with a biological cost that fell disproportionately, and often invisibly, on the male children born from these unions. This finding reshapes how we should think about the question at the center of this documentary in an important way. Whatever combination of curiosity, necessity, affection, or coercion brought a Neanderthal and a modern human together in any given encounter, the biological reality facing that pairing was demanding. Pregnancies were likely harder. Some ended in miscarriage. Male children who were born may often have struggled to have children of their own, meaning that many individual acts of interbreeding, even successful ones that produced a living child, simply failed to propagate any further down the family tree. This is part of why, despite what may have been thousands of years of overlapping contact and repeated interbreeding, the total surviving genetic contribution from Neanderthals amounts to only 1 to 2% of the modern human genome. It is not that interbreeding was rare. The genetic and archaeological evidence increasingly suggests it happened often. It is that the biological cost of that interbreeding was steep, and most of what was conceived across that steep cost did not survive to be counted in the genomes we study today. The picture, however, is not one of cost alone, and leaving it there would tell only half the story the evidence actually supports. Alongside the fertility problems documented on the X chromosome and the Y chromosome, researchers have also identified specific regions of Neanderthal ancestry that not only survived in modern human genomes, but actually increased in frequency over the following tens of thousands of years, spreading more widely through the population than random chance alone would predict. This is the genetic signature of positive selection, meaning these particular inherited traits provided some real, measurable survival advantage to the modern humans who carried them. The clearest examples involve the immune system and the skin. Neanderthals had lived in Eurasia for more than 300,000 years before modern humans arrived in any numbers, giving their immune systems a very long head start on adapting to the specific bacteria, viruses, and parasites present in that particular part of the world. When modern humans, freshly arrived from Africa, began interbreeding with Neanderthal populations, some of their children inherited Neanderthal immune gene variants already fine-tuned to local Eurasian pathogens, an advantage their purely African-derived immune systems had never needed to develop. Researchers studying present-day genomes have found that a significant proportion of the Neanderthal ancestry still carried by people today clusters specifically around genes involved in immune function, skin pigmentation, and metabolism, exactly the biological systems most directly shaped by climate, sunlight, and disease exposure. One evolutionary geneticist involved in dating the 2024 interbreeding studies explained this plainly, noting that Neanderthals had been living in these harsh, Ice Age environments for hundreds of thousands of years, already adapted to both the climate and its diseases, before any modern human ever set foot there. The specific effects traced to this inherited Neanderthal ancestry are remarkably wide-ranging, and modern genetic research continues to refine the list. A well-studied Neanderthal-derived variant near a gene called BNC2, found today in roughly 70% of people of European ancestry, is strongly associated with lighter skin pigmentation and a tendency toward freckling, one of the clearest examples of Neanderthal ancestry providing a direct adaptive advantage as modern human populations moved into higher latitudes with far less intense sunlight than equatorial Africa, where lighter skin allows the body to synthesize adequate vitamin D from weaker sun exposure. Other inherited Neanderthal variants have been linked to differences in blood clotting, susceptibility to certain autoimmune conditions, and, more recently and unexpectedly, to outcomes during the coronavirus pandemic that began in 2020, when researchers identified specific Neanderthal-derived gene variants that measurably influenced a person's risk of developing severe illness, some increasing risk, and at least one, on a different chromosome, appearing to offer modest protection instead. A parallel story, involving Neanderthals' cousins, the Denisovans, rather than Neanderthals directly, illustrates the same underlying principle even more vividly, and belongs in this account because it shows the mechanism at its clearest. Roughly 90% of Tibetans today carry a distinctive version of a gene called EPS1, which helps regulate how the body responds to low oxygen levels, allowing people who carry it to live and work at extreme altitude on the Tibetan Plateau without producing the dangerously thick, over-concentrated blood that afflicts most other humans who attempt to settle permanently above 4,000 meters. When researchers sequenced this specific stretch of DNA and searched for its origin, they found no match anywhere among the thousands of modern human genomes available to them. The match, when it finally came, was to the Denisovan genome recovered from that same cave in the Altai Mountains that gave this documentary the extraordinary story of Deni in an earlier chapter. The Tibetan high-altitude gene, carried today by tens of millions of people, is a direct, functioning inheritance from a population that otherwise vanished from the archaeological record tens of thousands of years ago, preserved and actively put to use because it solved a specific, life-threatening problem that the ancestors of modern Tibetans encountered only after Denisovans had already spent a very long time adapting to it. None of this should be mistaken for evidence that Neanderthal ancestry was uniformly beneficial, and responsible researchers are careful not to overstate the case in either direction. Much of the Neanderthal genetic material inherited by early modern humans appears, based on its steady depletion from the genome over many thousands of years, to have been mildly harmful on balance, gradually filtered out by natural selection across hundreds of generations, which is part of why total Neanderthal ancestry today sits at only 1 to 2% rather than something far higher. The picture that emerges when both the costs from the last chapter and the benefits described here are weighed honestly together is neither a story of pure biological catastrophe nor a story of straightforward genetic gift. It is a mixed, uneven inheritance, exactly what you would expect from two populations sitting, as David Reich put it, right at the edge of full biological compatibility, close enough to exchange real and lasting advantages, but not so close that the exchange came without cost. Chapter 7. A Child Buried with Care. In November of 1998, two archaeologists investigating reports of ancient rock paintings in central Portugal's Lapedo Valley stumbled instead onto something far more significant: In a limestone rock shelter called Lagar Velho, roughly 140 kilometers north of Lisbon, they found the largely complete skeleton of a young child, buried with unmistakable care. The body had been placed in a shallow pit and covered in red ochre, a mineral pigment that Ice Age communities across Europe used repeatedly in burials, likely carrying ritual or symbolic meaning. Around the child lay a pierced marine shell, almost certainly a pendant, positioned near the throat, along with animal remains and charcoal, suggesting a deliberate funerary act rather than an accidental burial. The excavation itself was nearly a disaster before it began. Years earlier, in 1992, construction equipment clearing the site had bulldozed away several meters of sediment, coming within a couple of centimeters of destroying the burial entirely. When archaeologists led by João Zilhão of the University of Lisbon finally recovered the remains, they had to painstakingly extract roughly 160 individual cranial fragments from soil laced with fine plant roots, eventually reconstructing about 80% of the child's skull. What they found once the skeleton was assembled and studied startled the research team. The child, who died at roughly 4 to 5 years old, showed a skull that was largely modern human in shape, particularly in the structure of the teeth and inner ear, but the child's lower limbs told a different story. The proportions of the legs, notably short and stocky, relative to a typical modern human child of the same age, closely resembled the limb proportions researchers associate with Neanderthals, a body plan long understood as an adaptation for retaining heat in cold climates. Certain other skeletal details, including features of the skull's occipital region at the back of the head, echoed Neanderthal anatomy as well. Zilhão and his colleagues proposed, in a paper that generated significant controversy at the time, that the Lepedo child, as the skeleton became known, represented the descendant of a population in which Neanderthals and modern humans had interbred, carrying forward a mixed anatomical inheritance several generations after any direct Neanderthal ancestor. This was a genuinely radical claim in 1999, made a full decade before Svante Pääbo's team would sequence the first Neanderthal genome and prove interbreeding had occurred at all. Many researchers at the time dismissed the idea outright, arguing that the child's unusual proportions could reflect ordinary human variation, or simply reflect the normal anatomical range of a young, stocky, Ice Age European child, without requiring any Neanderthal ancestry to explain them. That skepticism was reasonable, given the evidence available at the time. Skeletal anatomy alone, without genetic confirmation, can rarely settle a question this specific, since many different ancestries and adaptations can produce broadly similar bone proportions. The disagreement quickly became personal and, at moments, genuinely heated, a reminder that even careful scientists are still people capable of real conflict over interpretation. Erik Trinkhaus, one of the researchers who worked alongside Zilhão on the original find, argued publicly that the mixture of features could only be explained by prolonged genetic exchange between the two populations. Ian Tattersall of the American Museum of Natural History and Jeffrey Schwartz of the University of Pittsburgh, publishing a commentary in the same academic journal, offered a starkly different reading, describing the skeleton simply as an unusually solidly built child belonging to the standard early modern human population of the period, with no need to invoke Neanderthal ancestry to explain its proportions at all. The exchange that followed, part of a wider, sometimes bitter academic argument researchers at the time nicknamed the Neanderthal Wars, grew heated enough that Trinkhaus publicly stated the commentary suggested its authors did not know what they were discussing, and Tattersall responded that he was troubled by being characterized that way. This documentary raises that exchange not to take a side, but because it illustrates something important about how science actually works. Even careful, credentialed researchers looking at the exact same skeleton reached genuinely opposed conclusions, and did so with real conviction. That kind of open disagreement is not a sign that the underlying question is unanswerable. It is a sign that the answer had not yet been properly constrained by enough evidence, which is precisely the situation the 2025 radiocarbon dating breakthrough described below was designed to help resolve. Beyond the age itself, the Lepedo child's excavation revealed additional details that deepen the picture of how the child was mourned. The skeleton showed unmistakable staining from red ochre pigment covering much of the body, leading researchers to propose that the child may have been wrapped in a painted animal skin before burial, the pigment transferring onto the bones themselves as the wrapping decayed over the following millennia. Animal bones recovered from within the grave, including the pelvic remains of a red deer, initially raised the possibility that meat had been placed in the burial as a funerary offering. The 2025 dating study complicated this reading in an interesting way, showing that some of these animal remains were considerably older than the child itself, likely already present in the accumulated cave sediment before the burial took place, while other bones, including rabbit remains found directly on top of the child, were shown to be contemporaneous with the burial and may indeed represent a deliberate offering placed at the time of interment. Zillion has further proposed, based on patterns in how the surrounding rock shelter was used before and after the burial, that the child's death and burial may have led the community to treat the site as taboo, a place to be avoided until the memory of the event eventually faded, a pattern of grief-driven behavioral change that, if correct, would represent one of the earliest documented examples of a community's response to loss, reshaping how they used their physical landscape. The debate over the Lepedo child's exact ancestry has never been fully resolved, in part because no usable ancient DNA has yet been successfully recovered from the remains, and dental enamel and burial conditions in Portugal have made genetic preservation especially difficult. What has been resolved, more recently, is the child's age. A 2025 study led by researcher Bethan Linscott, using an advanced radiocarbon dating technique applied directly to a specific amino acid preserved in the child's bone collagen, produced a precise date. The Lepedo child lived between roughly 27,780 and 28,550 years before the present. This finding carries its own layer of intrigue. By this date, Neanderthals as a distinct population had already been extinct in most of Europe for over 10,000 years and had vanished even from their last known refuges in Iberia by roughly 28,000 years ago. If the child truly carried recent Neanderthal ancestry, that ancestry would have to trace back through several earlier generations of a population already living, by that point, entirely among modern humans, carrying inherited Neanderthal traits forward the way any inherited family trait persists, quietly, without requiring the presence of any living Neanderthal at all. Whether or not the Lepedo child specifically carried Neanderthal ancestry, and reasonable, careful researchers still disagree on this point, the burial practice itself is worth placing in a wider context, because it turns out the ochre and the careful placement of a body were not unique to modern human communities at all. When the Buissonnet brothers excavated a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France in 1908, they found the body resting in a rectangular pit with straight walls and a flat bottom, features consistent with a grave deliberately dug rather than a natural depression. Holding the remains fully articulated, meaning the joints and bones remained connected in their correct anatomical positions, the clearest sign researchers look for that a body was buried soon after death, rather than left exposed to scavengers and the slow scattering effects of time. A century later, in 2014, a fresh excavation at the same site, incorporating modern archaeological techniques unavailable to the original excavators, confirmed the stratigraphic evidence supporting intentional burial. At a second French site, La Ferracie, researchers uncovered an even more striking discovery: the buried remains of an adult man and an adult woman, together with 3 children and a fetus, all interred within a single clearly defined burial area. Evidence, however incomplete, of a family group treated with consistent, deliberate funerary care. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, the same cave whose remains gave this documentary its portrait of a severely disabled man kept alive for years by his community, excavator Ralph Selecki controversially proposed in the mid-20th century that one burial showed traces of flower pollen clustered around the body, raising the possibility of flowers deliberately placed as part of a funerary rite. That specific claim has faced serious scientific pushback over the decades, with some researchers arguing the pollen could have been introduced by burrowing rodents rather than by mourners. A genuine and unresolved scholarly disagreement this documentary will not pretend to settle. But renewed excavation at Shanidar in the years since, including the recovery of a newly identified individual, researchers have named Shanidar Z, has reinforced the broader case for intentional Neanderthal burial at the site, independent of the contested flower question, adding to a body of nearly 40 possible Neanderthal burial sites identified across Europe and Western Asia, a small number of which show genuinely complex funerary treatment, extending well beyond simple disposal of a body. Placed against this backdrop, the Lepedo child's burial no longer looks like an isolated, unexplainable act of tenderness performed by a purely modern human community for a child who happened to look a little unusual. It looks like part of a shared funerary tradition, ochre, careful body placement, and deliberate ritual that both modern humans and Neanderthals appear to have practiced independently, and which their possible descendants, in a case like the Lepedo child, may have carried forward together. Whoever this child was, whatever combination of ancestry ran through their small body, their community buried them with the same care, the same ochre, the same small personal ornament that Ice Age communities across Europe, modern human and Neanderthal alike, gave to those they loved and grieved. If the child did carry Neanderthal ancestry, inherited from a great-grandparent or more distant relative, nothing about the burial suggests that ancestry made the child less fully a member of their community, less worthy of ritual, less mourned. The evidence of care is unambiguous. The evidence of ancestry remains genuinely contested. Together, they offer a rare glimpse of how a mixed inheritance may have been received, not as a mark of shame or difference requiring explanation, but simply as part of who a beloved child was. Chapter 8. What the DNA Cannot Say. This is the chapter where honesty matters most, because it is here that this investigation must confront the limits of its own evidence, directly and without flinching, rather than letting a good story quietly paper over them. A genome is an extraordinary historical document. It can tell researchers with real confidence that 2 populations mixed. It can tell them roughly when that mixing happened, sometimes to within a few thousand years. It can tell them how much genetic material survived the mixing and made it into later generations. In cases like OASE-1, it can even tell them how many generations back a specific ancestor lived. What a genome cannot do, under any circumstances, with any technology currently available or plausibly on the horizon, is tell researchers what the people involved were thinking, feeling, or choosing at the moment their children were conceived. DNA does not record consent. It does not record affection. It does not record fear or negotiation or love or coercion. It records only the biological outcome, stripped of every emotional and social circumstance that produced it. This means the question in this documentary's title, whether Neanderthals chose human partners, sits partly outside what DNA evidence alone can answer. It is not a failure of the science. It is simply a boundary the science was never built to cross. Any documentary, book, or article that tells you with confidence exactly what a specific ancient encounter felt like, whether tender or violent, romantic or transactional, is going beyond what the genetic record actually supports. Responsible researchers are careful about this distinction, even when popular retellings of their work are not. As one researcher involved in dating the interbreeding period put it plainly when discussing the topic, it is difficult to know the nature of the interaction between modern humans and Neanderthals from genome data alone, beyond being able to say that they mixed and had children together. So where does that leave an honest investigation? It leaves us looking for indirect evidence, drawn from archaeology rather than genetics, that can at least narrow the range of plausible circumstances, even if it cannot deliver certainty. And here the picture that has emerged over the past several years is more interesting and more mixed than either a purely romantic or a purely violent narrative would suggest. On one side of the evidence, researchers working at a site called Tinshemit Cave in Israel, under the direction of Professor Yossi Zeidner of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, alongside colleagues from Tel Aviv University, uncovered findings published in the journal Nature Human Behavior describing extensive cultural overlap between Neanderthal and modern human communities roughly 110,000 years ago, considerably earlier than the main interbreeding wave discussed earlier in this film, but revealing of how contact could unfold when it did occur. At Tinshemit, both populations used the same sophisticated stone tool technique, known as the Levallois technique, employed broadly similar strategies for hunting large game such as deer, wild horses and aurochs, and, most strikingly, appear to have developed comparable burial customs, including formal graves, a practice found at this site in numbers unusually high for its time period. Zeidner has described the pattern uncovered at Tinshemit as evidence of a genuine melting pot, where technology, hunting knowledge, and even symbolic funerary behavior moved between the two populations, suggesting a degree of shared social life, or at minimum sustained mutual observation and exchange, that goes well beyond mere passing tolerance. On the other side of the evidence, a separate body of research points toward real and sometimes lethal conflict. Skeletal trauma consistent with interpersonal violence has been documented at multiple Neanderthal sites, including one especially striking case from Shanidar Cave in Iraq, where a Neanderthal individual shows what researchers interpret as a wound consistent with being struck by a projectile weapon to the chest, a type of weapon associated more strongly with modern human hunting technology than with typical Neanderthal toolkits. Researchers studying broader patterns of skeletal injury across Neanderthal populations have also documented a notably high rate of trauma to the skull and forearms, the kind of injury pattern consistent, though not conclusively so, with close combat and defensive wounds. Some researchers argue this trauma pattern reflects primarily hunting accidents and the ordinary hazards of pursuing dangerous large game at close range, a genuinely risky occupation on its own. Others argue at least some of it reflects direct conflict, whether between rival Neanderthal groups, between Neanderthals and modern humans, or both. This particular piece of evidence has itself been substantially revised in recent years, in a way worth walking through carefully because it shows responsible science correcting an earlier overstatement. In 1995, researchers Thomas Berger and Eric Trinkhaus first drew attention to what they described as an unusually high rate of head and neck trauma among Neanderthal skeletons, noting that roughly 30% of examined individuals showed signs of cranial injury, a pattern they compared, memorably, to injuries typically seen among modern professional rodeo riders, athletes who repeatedly place themselves at close range to large, powerful, frightened animals. The comparison suggested Neanderthals lived unusually dangerous lives, injured again and again by the physical demands of hunting massive game with thrusting spears at close quarters. Direct physical evidence recovered from a Neanderthal hunting site in Germany, dated to roughly 120,000 years ago, has since confirmed that this style of close-range hunting really did occur, with researchers using ballistic modeling and wound analysis on ancient deer skeletons to demonstrate exactly how a low-velocity thrusting spear produces a distinctive puncture pattern in bone. But a large-scale, population-level reassessment of Neanderthal trauma rates, published in the journal Nature in 2018, complicated the original rodeo rider comparison significantly. Analyzing an exhaustive database of Neanderthal skeletal remains and correcting for factors like preservation bias, this newer study found that Neanderthal rates of cranial trauma were, in fact, statistically similar to the rates found among early modern humans living during the very same period, not dramatically higher, as the earlier, more limited sample had suggested. This finding does not mean Neanderthal life was safe. It means Neanderthal life appears to have been roughly as physically dangerous as modern human life during the same harsh Ice Age period. No more and no less, undercutting the older, more sensational image of Neanderthals as uniquely battered, uniquely violent, or uniquely doomed by the hazards of their own existence. A research team working for over a decade on remains from the Troisième Caverne of Goyet in Belgium added a difficult new layer to this picture in 2025, combining ancient DNA analysis, radiocarbon dating, and isotopic testing capable of identifying where a person likely spent their childhood based on chemical signatures absorbed into their teeth. The team identified at least 6 Neanderthal individuals whose bones showed clear signs of deliberate butchery, cut marks, fracture patterns, and breakage consistent with processing for food, treated in a manner closely resembling how the same community processed the bones of hunted animals found in the same cave layer. The victims were overwhelmingly women and children, and isotopic evidence indicated they had grown up in a different region entirely from where their remains were ultimately found, suggesting they were not members of the local Neanderthal community, but had been brought in from elsewhere. Researchers involved described this pattern as evidence of exocannibalism, meaning cannibalism directed at outsiders rather than at members of one's own group, and proposed that it may reflect violent conflict between rival Neanderthal bands competing for shrinking resources late in the population's history, rather than a ritual or mourning practice directed at their own dead. This finding does not involve modern humans directly. It concerns violence between different Neanderthal communities, but it belongs in this account because it demonstrates, starkly, that the same population capable of the sustained tenderness documented at Shanidar toward one of their own, and the same population capable of the shared technology and burial customs documented at Tinchamet, was also capable of organized, sustained violence against outsiders when circumstances turned desperate. This documentary handles this evidence with restraint, because it deserves restraint, but it cannot be left out. Any honest account of what Neanderthals were capable of, and by extension what any given encounter between Neanderthals and modern humans may have involved, has to hold both possibilities at once. Most researchers who study this question carefully resist collapsing it into a single simple answer, and this documentary will resist that temptation as well. Anthropologist John Shea, addressing the question of whether Neanderthals and modern humans went to war, has pointed out that direct fossil evidence of face-to-face contact between the two populations remains genuinely limited, meaning that whether any given encounter unfolded with hostility or indifference likely varied enormously by time, place, and circumstance. In a world as sparsely populated as Ice Age Eurasia, with vast unclaimed territory available, violent confrontation may often have been the costlier and less attractive option compared with simply avoiding each other, or moving on. At the same time, resource competition, particularly during periods of climate stress when both populations were drawing on the same shrinking herds of game, could plausibly have pushed some encounters toward conflict rather than cooperation. There is a further layer to this uncertainty worth naming directly, because it complicates any simple emotional reading of these encounters still further. Researchers studying the long period of overlap between Neanderthals and modern humans have proposed that disease transmission between the two populations may itself help explain why contact between them continued, on and off, for such an unusually long stretch of time, rather than resolving quickly in one direction or the other. A study modeling this dynamic suggested that recurring waves of infection passing between the two populations, each initially lacking immunity to diseases the other population had already adapted to, could have repeatedly weakened local group sizes on both sides, creating a long, grinding equilibrium in which neither population could fully displace the other for thousands of years, even as small-scale contact, including reproduction, continued throughout. If this model is correct, it means at least some of the historical relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans involved not just the possibility of violence or cooperation between individuals, but the invisible, impersonal pressure of shared disease, working on both populations simultaneously in ways neither could have understood or controlled. A reminder that the full context surrounding any given ancient encounter included forces far beyond the immediate choices, however constrained, of the two people directly involved. What this range of evidence tells us, taken honestly and as a whole, is that there was no single kind of encounter between Neanderthals and modern humans. Some contact, as Tinshemit Cave suggests, involved genuine cultural exchange, shared technology, and possibly shared ritual life extending across generations. Other contact, as skeletal trauma at multiple sites suggests, involved violence, sometimes fatal. Both of these realities coexisted across the tens of thousands of years and the enormous geographic range over which the two populations overlapped. Reproduction, when it happened, occurred somewhere inside this full spectrum of possible relationships, ranging from what may have resembled genuine partnership to what may have resembled exploitation or worse, and the archaeological and genetic record, on its own, generally cannot tell us which specific circumstance produced any specific child whose ancestry survives in a genome today. This is not a satisfying answer for anyone hoping for a clean, simple story. It is, however, the honest one, and it sets up the final and most difficult question this documentary must address. Given everything the evidence does and does not allow us to say, is there any responsible way to use a word like choice at all when discussing Neanderthal and human reproduction? And if so, what would that word actually have to mean? Chapter 9. Were they even capable of choosing to ask whether Neanderthals chose human partners? We first have to ask a more basic question that the 19th and much of the 20th century answered wrongly. Were Neanderthals the kind of beings capable of anything resembling choice at all, in the social and emotional sense that word implies? For most of the history of Neanderthal research, the honest answer given by most scientists was dismissive. Neanderthals were portrayed as brutish, low-browed, barely verbal, closer to animal instinct than to human deliberation. If that portrayal were accurate, the question in this documentary's title would answer itself. Animals following instinct do not choose partners in any meaningful sense. They simply respond to biological drives. That portrayal, modern archaeology has shown decisively, was wrong, and it was wrong for reasons that have as much to do with 19th century prejudice as with 19th century evidence. Early reconstructions of Neanderthal posture and appearance were based partly on the skeleton of an elderly individual from La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, whose spine was badly deformed by severe arthritis, a condition later researchers mistook for the natural Neanderthal stance, rather than an individual medical condition. That stooped, shuffling caricature, more monster than man, shaped public imagination for decades and, uncomfortably, aligned conveniently with the racial hierarchies popular among many European scientists of the era, who were inclined to see any non-modern human population as biologically and culturally primitive, a framework historians of science now recognize as having served, whether consciously or not, to justify contemporary ideas about racial superiority. The actual evidence tells a very different story, one built not on assumption but on the direct physical traces Neanderthals left behind. Consider the case of an individual known to researchers as Shanidar I, excavated from Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan and dated to somewhere between 45,000 and 70,000 years old. This man suffered a severe blow to the head early in life, along with the eventual loss of his right arm at the elbow, serious leg injuries, and progressive hearing loss severe enough to have left him functionally deaf. And yet the healed bone throughout his skeleton shows he survived for years, likely a decade or more, after these injuries occurred. A one-armed, partially blind, likely deaf Neanderthal man, unable to fully hunt, unable to fully defend himself, unable even to hear an approaching predator, lived on regardless, which is only possible if other members of his group consistently provided him with food, protection, and practical support long after he had stopped being able to provide those things fully for himself. Researchers who study this kind of evidence describe it carefully, because it would be easy to overstate. Some scholars, examining cases like Shanidar I closely, have asked directly whether this pattern of survival reflects what they term calculated support, meaning a pragmatic decision to keep a still useful group member alive for reasons of practical value, or something closer to what most people would recognize as genuine caring, motivated by emotional bonds and moral concern independent of practical calculation. Honest researchers acknowledge that skeletal evidence alone often cannot distinguish cleanly between these possibilities. But whichever motivation predominated, both explanations require something that mere instinct does not. They require the capacity to recognize another individual's specific, ongoing needs, to model what that individual required to survive, and to sustain a deliberate, extended pattern of behavior in response over years, without any guarantee of immediate reward. That is not a simple reflex. It is a form of social reasoning. Shanidar I is not an isolated case either. Skeletal remains from other Neanderthal sites show comparable patterns of survival past disabling injury, including individuals who lived for extended periods after losing teeth necessary for normal chewing, and others whose healed but severely malformed limbs would have made independent hunting or foraging effectively impossible. Considered together, this body of evidence describes a consistent pattern across Neanderthal populations spanning a wide geographic range and a long span of time, not a single unusual case that might be explained away as an anomaly. Whatever combination of practical calculation and genuine emotional attachment motivated this behavior, it appears to have been a stable, recurring feature of how Neanderthal communities operated, not a rare exception. The broader archaeological record reinforces this picture, and here the evidence moves from suggestive to genuinely decisive. For most of the 20th century, the ability to create symbolic art, painting, deliberate markings, meaningful abstract design, was treated as one of the defining, uncrossable lines separating modern humans from every other hominin population, including Neanderthals. That line was erased in 2018, when a research team led by Dirk Hoffman of the Max Planck Institute and Alistair Pike of the University of Southampton published dating results for cave paintings found at 3 separate sites in Spain: La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales, using a radiometric technique called uranium-thorium dating. which measures the age of thin mineral crusts that naturally form over a painting as water drips down a cave wall over thousands of years. The team established minimum ages for a red ladder-shaped symbol, a hand stencil, and painted formations on natural stone columns. Every one of these works dated to older than 64,800 years. Modern humans are not documented to have reached this part of Europe until roughly 20,000 years later. There is no remaining scientific argument that these particular paintings could have been made by anyone other than Neanderthals. The researchers involved were direct about what this finding meant. Writing in the journal Science, they concluded that the evidence left no doubt that Neanderthals shared symbolic thinking with early modern humans, and that, so far as material culture allows researchers to judge, Neanderthals and early modern humans were cognitively indistinguishable from one another. A separate piece of evidence reported alongside the cave paintings, deliberately shaped and pierced marine shells recovered from a cave called Cueva de los Aviones in southeastern Spain, pushed the timeline for Neanderthal personal ornamentation back even further, to roughly 115,000 years ago, decorated jewelry older than any comparable modern human artifact yet discovered anywhere. More recently, researchers have identified an even more intimate trace of this capacity, a Neanderthal fingerprint pressed directly into a dot of red ochre, deliberately applied to a small stone, dated to more than 42,000 years ago, a literal physical touchpoint between a specific Neanderthal individual and a deliberate act of symbolic mark-making, care taken over an object that served no practical survival purpose whatsoever. Beyond the visual record, Neanderthals used red ochre pigment for purposes researchers believe were symbolic or decorative, well beyond cave painting alone, incorporating it into activities ranging from body decoration to, at one site in the Netherlands, a substance mixed with bitumen apparently used as an adhesive, suggesting sophisticated, deliberate material knowledge applied toward more than one purpose. They fashioned jewelry from eagle talons and pierced shells, personal ornamentation that served no obvious practical survival function beyond social communication and display. Evidence from sites including Bruniquel Cave in France shows structures built from broken stalagmites, deliberately arranged in circular patterns roughly 176,000 years ago, deep inside a cave system. Work that would have required organized group effort, controlled fire for light, and some shared purpose beyond simple survival. Genetic research comparing modern humans and Neanderthals has found that both populations carry closely related versions of a gene called FOXP2, associated with the neural circuitry underlying complex spoken language, alongside a hyoid bone structure, the small bone supporting the tongue and throat. Closely resembling the modern human version, both findings consistent with a genuine capacity for complex vocal communication, though researchers remain appropriately cautious about claiming certainty regarding exactly how sophisticated Neanderthal language actually was. One further comparison bears directly on the question of choice, and it comes from studying how the two populations organized their intimate lives at the level of whole communities rather than individual encounters. In 2017, a research team led by Eske Willerslev of the University of Copenhagen and Cambridge's St. John's College sequenced the genomes of 4 individuals buried together at Sunghir, a well-known Upper Paleolithic site in Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago. An adult man, 2 younger individuals buried head-to-head in a single grave, and a second adult represented by a symbolically modified bone. Given that these 4 people were buried together and had clearly lived in the same small community, researchers expected to find them closely related. Genetic analysis showed the opposite. None of the 4 individuals were more closely related than second cousins. Evidence, the research team concluded, of a deliberate, structured system for finding partners outside one's immediate family and immediate living group. a network of connections between separate communities specifically built, it appears, to avoid the genetic and social costs of inbreeding within a small population. Willerslev and his colleagues explicitly contrasted this finding with genetic evidence from an earlier sequenced Neanderthal individual from the Altai Mountains, whose genome showed clear signs of close inbreeding, consistent with a small, isolated group that had not developed or had not been able to sustain a comparable network for exchanging partners across communities. The researchers were careful to note real uncertainty in interpreting this contrast, since it remains unclear whether Neanderthal groups generally lacked this kind of wider mating network, or whether the one sequenced Altai individual simply reflects an unusually isolated case, a question that will require many more sequenced Neanderthal genomes from different regions to resolve with confidence. If modern human communities during this period had, in fact, developed sophisticated social systems specifically oriented around seeking partners beyond the immediate group, systems substantial enough to require ceremony, ritual, and the deliberate maintenance of ties between separate bands, that context matters enormously for understanding what it may have meant when a modern human group's search for outside partners intersected with a nearby Neanderthal community. It suggests that at least some modern human groups approached partner seeking as an active, organized, socially sanctioned behavior embedded in ritual and community structure, rather than as a matter of pure chance encounter. Whether Neanderthal communities extended this same organized system to include modern human partners specifically, or whether Neanderthal partners were incorporated into these networks through the same social logic that governed exchange between separate Neanderthal bands, remains beyond what current evidence can confirm. But it adds one more piece to the case, that reproduction across this ancient divide did not have to occur only through chance or force. In at least some communities, seeking a partner from beyond one's own group appears to have been an expected, structured, and socially supported part of ordinary life. Taken together, this evidence supports a conclusion that would have scandalized much of 19th and even mid-20th century science. Neanderthals were not simpler, instinct-driven animals incapable of social reasoning. They were, so far as the evidence can show, cognitively and socially complex people, capable of sustained care for the vulnerable, symbolic communication, cooperative labor, and very likely complex language. This does not prove that any specific Neanderthal chose a modern human partner in the way a person today might describe choosing a spouse. It does establish something necessary before that question can even be responsibly asked. Whatever happened between Neanderthals and modern humans, it happened between two populations that were, as far as the evidence can tell us, roughly comparable in their basic capacity for social reasoning, emotional attachment, and deliberate behavior. Neither side of any given encounter was the simple, instinct-driven brute that older, prejudiced science once imagined. Both sides were, in every meaningful sense the evidence allows us to test, people. Chapter 10. What absorption actually meant. By roughly 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals as a distinct, identifiable population had vanished from the archaeological record across most of Europe, a disappearance whose true causes this chapter must now examine as carefully and completely as it can. Their last confirmed refuges, in isolated pockets of the Iberian Peninsula, held on for a few thousand years longer before disappearing entirely by roughly 28,000 years ago. For most of the 20th century, this disappearance was described using the vocabulary of extinction and replacement. Neanderthals, in the popular telling, were outcompeted, driven to extinction by a smarter, more adaptable modern human species that simply took their place. It is a clean story, with a clear winner and a clear loser, and it fits comfortably alongside older, comfortable assumptions about human progress and inevitable improvement. Modern researchers studying this question, it should be said plainly, do not all agree on a single cause, and a responsible account of this documentary's final chapter has to represent that disagreement honestly, rather than pretending the matter is settled. Some research teams have built detailed climate models showing that repeated, severe cold snaps during the final tens of thousands of years of Neanderthal history transformed much of Central Europe's open woodland into a harsh, Arctic-like steppe, environments that hit Neanderthal populations, heavily dependent on hunting large game for protein, especially hard, while modern human groups, with a more varied diet drawing on fish, plants, and smaller game alongside large mammals, proved more able to weather the same climatic shocks. Other researchers have built competing mathematical models, suggesting that climate and direct competition were not even necessary to explain the outcome, because Neanderthal populations were already small, spread thin across a huge territory. These models show that ordinary small population risks, difficulty finding mates, the gradual accumulation of harmful mutations through inbreeding, and simple bad luck in birth and death rates year over year, could alone have been sufficient to drive the population toward collapse, even if Neanderthals had matched modern humans exactly, in every measure of intelligence, culture, and adaptability. Still, other researchers argue that competitive exclusion, meaning direct competition between the two populations for the same limited hunting grounds and shelter sites as modern human numbers grew, was the decisive factor, pointing to detailed reconstructions showing Neanderthal range contracting specifically in step with modern human range expansion, in patterns climate shifts alone do not fully explain. A 2021 survey of the scientific literature on this question described the field bluntly as a highly polarized debate, divided into separate camps, each defending its own preferred explanation, a genuinely unresolved argument rather than settled scientific consensus. What nearly all of these competing explanations agree on, however, and what recent genetic modeling has reinforced directly, is the underlying role that interbreeding itself likely played in the final outcome, regardless of which additional factor, climate, competition, or simple demographic bad luck, ultimately tipped the balance. A mathematical model published in 2025 demonstrated that, even without invoking any catastrophic event at all, no climate collapse, no epidemic, no violent conquest, sustained small-scale immigration of modern humans into Neanderthal territory. Combined with the ordinary recurring gene mixing this documentary has traced across its full 10 chapters, could alone account for something close to the complete genetic absorption of the Neanderthal population into the much larger modern human population, over a period of roughly 10 to 30,000 years, a time frame that matches remarkably well with what the archaeological record actually shows. The researchers behind this model were explicit that their approach required no assumption of violence, no assumption of disease, and no assumption that modern humans were in any way biologically or cognitively superior. It required only that modern human immigration into the region was sustained, that interbreeding occurred at a modest and realistic rate, and that the two starting populations were unequal in size, exactly the conditions this documentary has established through the genetic, archaeological, and skeletal evidence explored across every chapter so far. The scientist most responsible for popularizing this reframing, evolutionary biologist Chris Stringer of London's Natural History Museum, and researchers building on the Princeton team's 2024 findings, describe this outcome not as one population being killed off by another, but as something closer to a slow demographic tide, in which a smaller population, however capable, however socially sophisticated, however biologically compatible with its larger neighbor, was gradually and irreversibly folded into that neighbor's much larger gene pool, generation after generation, through the accumulated weight of ordinary reproduction rather than any single decisive event. Commenting on this research, one evolutionary biologist observed that the decreasing Neanderthal population was ultimately being absorbed into the modern human gene pool, and noted that the rapidity of the Neanderthals' demise as a visibly distinct population was itself striking, consistent with a small population being gradually and thoroughly folded into a much larger one, rather than driven to extinction through direct violent conquest alone. This reframing matters enormously for how we should think about the question of choice raised throughout this film. If Neanderthals were simply killed off, replaced wholesale by an invading population with whom they rarely mixed, then the handful of interbreeding events preserved in the genetic record would represent isolated, perhaps exceptional incidents, unrepresentative of how the two populations generally related to each other. But the evidence assembled here, the 200,000 years of recurring contact identified by Aki and Lee, the intensive mixing period lasting 6,000 to 7,000 years, identified independently by two separate 2024 studies, the unusually high recent Neanderthal ancestry carried by OAC1, the possible hybrid child buried with careful ritual at Lagar Velho, the shared tools, hunting strategies, and burial customs documented at Tinchemet Cave. All of this points towards something closer to the opposite conclusion. Interbreeding was not a rare aberration on the margins of an otherwise hostile relationship. It was frequent enough and successful enough, at least in some times and places, to become one of the primary mechanisms by which an entire ancient human population's genetic legacy was carried forward into the deep future, embedded permanently in the bodies of billions of people who would never know their names. None of this erases the harder evidence explored earlier in this film. The complete absence of Neanderthal Y chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA in every person tested to date still tells us that many of these unions, probably most, came at a real biological cost, likely including miscarriage and reduced fertility among male hybrid offspring, evidence that these encounters, whatever else they were not always simple or symmetrical in their outcomes. The skeletal trauma documented at multiple Neanderthal sites still tells us that violence was a real and recurring feature of this long relationship, not a myth invented by squeamish modern sensibilities. The genuine, ongoing scholarly disagreement about individual cases like the Lepedo child still tells us that even our best current evidence leaves real uncertainty standing in places we would like it resolved. A responsible telling of this story cannot choose to remember only the cooperative, tender possibilities and quietly discard the difficult ones. Both were real, both left their mark. What can be said, honestly and without overreaching beyond what the evidence supports, is this. Somewhere across 200,000 years and thousands of miles of Ice Age Eurasia, two different kinds of people, each fully capable, so far as the evidence allows us to judge, of social reasoning, emotional attachment, care for the vulnerable, and deliberate behavior, repeatedly found themselves close enough to each other to have children together. Some of those encounters likely involved violence. Some, as sites like Tinchemet suggest, likely involved genuine shared community, technology, and possibly ritual life extending across generations. Most individual unions, whatever their nature, left no lasting genetic trace at all, their family lines simply ending within a few generations, as most family lines throughout history eventually do. But enough of them, across enough time, succeeded well enough to leave the trace that survives inside you. If your ancestry lies outside Africa, right now, in nearly every cell of your body, it is worth pausing on just how strange and durable that inheritance actually is. Somewhere around 1,800 generations separate a person alive today from the individuals whose unions this documentary has traced. Individuals who left behind no name, no memory, no story anyone chose to tell about them, only a physical trace small enough to hide inside a strand of DNA, and persistent enough to survive every single one of those 1800 generations without being fully erased. Wars, migrations, famines, the rise and fall of every civilization anyone has ever built, all of it happened on top of that trace, and none of it managed to remove it entirely. That kind of persistence is not accidental. It reflects something specific and measurable, a segment of inherited biology sitting close enough to useful that natural selection, across 2,000 centuries, chose again and again to keep it rather than discard it. In skin, in immune cells, in the invisible chemistry that helped distant ancestors survive winters, infections, and altitudes their African forebears had never needed to face. No single decision made by any one person in any one encounter could have produced that outcome alone. It took thousands of separate lives, most of them entirely unremembered, each contributing one small, ordinary act of survival and reproduction, before the pattern became permanent enough for a laboratory in the 21st century to read it back out of a living person's blood. Whether any single one of those encounters involved something a modern person would recognize and call choice is a question the evidence, honestly examined, cannot answer with certainty for any specific case. But the deeper question this documentary set out to investigate has a clearer answer than it might first have seemed. The people who carried Neanderthal ancestry forward were not, as older science once insisted, biologically or socially incapable of anything resembling partnership. They were people, on both sides of that ancient divide, fully capable of the same range of human relationship that exists today, from violence to indifference to genuine care, operating within a biological reality that made every successful union between them, in David Reich's careful words, sit right at the very edge of what was possible at all. Conclusion: return for a moment to that jawbone in the Romanian cave, the one this film opened with. A man, dead nearly 40,000 years, whose great-great-grandparent, or perhaps a relative closer still, was fully, unmistakably Neanderthal. He did not know he would become a case study. He did not know his bones would one day travel to a laboratory in Germany, or that his genome would be read letter by researchers using techniques no one alive in his own lifetime could have imagined. He was simply a man, living in a cold river valley, carrying inside his own body the physical proof of something that had happened in his family a few generations back, something that may have been ordinary enough, in his own community, to require no explanation at all. This documentary set out to ask whether Neanderthals chose human partners, and it would be dishonest to pretend that question now has a single, tidy answer. It does not, and no responsible documentary claiming otherwise would deserve your trust. What it has, instead, is something more valuable than a tidy answer. It has a clear map of exactly what the evidence can and cannot tell us, drawn as honestly and carefully as current science allows. The DNA proves, beyond argument, that Neanderthals and modern humans had children together, repeatedly, across a span of at least 200,000 years, concentrated most heavily in an intense mixing period around 47,000 years ago. It proves those unions came at real biological cost, a cost written permanently into the empty space where Neanderthal Y chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA should be, but are not, a gap this film has tried to explain rather than simply gesture toward. It proves, through cave paintings older than modern humans' arrival in Europe, through a one-armed man kept alive for a decade by people who did not have to keep him alive, through burials given as much care by Neanderthal hands as by modern human ones, that whatever happened between these two populations happened between people fully capable, in every way archaeology can currently test, of choice, care, cruelty, and love, exactly as modern humans are. What the evidence cannot do, and what this film has refused to pretend otherwise, is reach inside any single encounter and tell you what it felt like to the two people involved. It cannot tell you whether the parents of OASE-1's Neanderthal ancestor found each other through violence or through something closer to affection. It cannot tell you what the Lepedo child's family believed about where their child's unusual proportions came from, or whether they thought about it at all. That silence is not a failure of this investigation. It is the honest shape of the evidence itself, and pretending otherwise, filling that silence with comforting invention or manufactured drama, would betray the very standard of trust this documentary has tried to hold from its opening minute to this one. Perhaps the more useful question, in the end, is not whether any single ancient encounter involved choice in the exact modern sense of that word, but what the sheer persistence of the outcome tells us regardless. Something in those long-ago meetings, across thousands of years and an entire continent, succeeded often enough, and stably enough, to survive the near-impossible odds of prehistoric survival, and reach every person alive today whose ancestry traces outside Africa. That is not the genetic signature of a single accident. It is the signature of something sustained, something that kept happening, generation after generation, in enough places and among enough people that its cumulative trace became permanent. Whatever word belongs to that pattern, chosen, tolerated, necessary, or something with no single modern equivalent at all, it was substantial enough to survive being folded, again and again, into the deep and ordinary business of raising the next generation, one birth, one winter, one small act of care at a time, repeated across more lives than any single record could ever name. Think back to the question this film asked you to hold at the very beginning, about someone in your own family who loved a person others considered too different to belong. That question was not decoration. It was the emotional center this entire investigation has been circling from the start, long before the final answer could be responsibly given. Every person watching this film carries, in the strictest scientific sense, the descendants of encounters that crossed a boundary between two different kinds of humans, encounters that happened in landscapes so cold, so demanding, and so distant from anything in modern experience that imagining them honestly requires real effort. And yet the outcome of those encounters sits inside you right now, in genes that shape your skin, your immune system, the way your body responds to a virus that did not exist until the year 2020, and countless smaller details of your biology you will never think to trace back to their true origin. It became part of the biological instructions written into nearly every person who ever left Africa, carried forward without ceremony, without memory, and without anyone's permission, by two different kinds of humans who, at the very edge of what biology allowed, kept finding their way back to each other anyway.